today we're going to be looking at this question of why does suffering exist? Why is there sin and evil in the world? Because much of our world is shaped by a struggle to understand this question. Not just inside the church, but outside as well. It's something that everyone struggles with. And our first example is I've got an excerpt from a letter from Charles Darwin. I want us to listen to what he says here. It's writing to his friend. He says, "I cannot see as plainly as others do, and as I should wish to do, evidence of design and beneficence on all sides of us. There seems to me too much misery in the world. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the ichneumonidae, which is a type of parasitic wasp, with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice." So here Darwin is looking out at the world, and he sees all this unnecessary suffering. You know, elsewhere where he talks about a cat playing with a mice, he says that he could understand why a cat would need to kill a mice to eat, but why would it need to catch it and then just cause it all this unnecessary fear and suffering and just playing with it before it kills it? You know, and why should there be this parasitic wasp that puts its larvae inside caterpillars so that they can eat it alive? Darwin's looking out at the world and he's seeing all this suffering. And he's saying that his mind cannot understand how a God who is beneficent and omnipotent, who is loving and all-powerful, could exist in a world where this suffering exists. And because of Darwin's struggle to understand this problem of suffering, he came up with this theory of evolution, an alternate theory that could explain the existence of the world and the suffering in it. And so we're going to look at this today because, as I said before, the struggle to understand the question of suffering has shaped much of our world. And it's because of these three biblical facts that we find. First, here in 1 John 4:8, it says, "He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love." That is the first fact we have to deal with. Our God is a God of love. The second fact here is stated here in Revelation 19, verse 6. He says, "And I heard, as it were, the voice of a great multitude, and as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of a mighty thundering, saying, Hallelujah, for the Lord God omnipotent reigneth." Here it calls God omnipotent, all-powerful. He is the Almighty. So God is a God of love, and he is all-powerful. And the third fact that goes with this is here in Romans 8:22. He says, "For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pains together until now." Suffering exists. So when we put these three biblical facts together, we find the same problem that Darwin found. God is love. He doesn't want us to suffer. God is omnipotent. He's all-powerful. He's capable of stopping suffering. Yet suffering still exists. There's a problem that arises from these three biblical facts, one that Darwin struggled with. And I'm going to share this quote from Epicurus, who's a Greek philosopher who had a struggle with the same problem. And he put it this way: "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?" And Epicurus was, his views were akin to deism. He believed that God may have started the world at one point in the past, but then he's just gone away and he's left us to our own. And this was his argument for it. If there is a God who is loving and all-powerful, then why is there evil in the world? And so this problem that Darwin was struggling with wasn't a new problem. from ancient philosophers to the birth of modern evolution and what's driven a lot of scientists today and a lot of people in rejecting God. It's the question that people have been struggling with for millennia. And it's not just these philosophers and scientists, people outside the church that struggle with this. I want us to listen to what Jeremiah has to say here. Jeremiah, in the book of Jeremiah, 12 verse 1. He says, "Thou art righteous, O Lord, when I plead with thee. Yet let me talk with thee of thy judgments. Wherefore doth the way of the wicked prosper? Wherefore are all they happy that deal very treacherously?" Now, I want us to notice what Jeremiah is saying here, because Jeremiah is one of the prophets, suffered his fair share of suffering and trials at the hands of those who he was called to go and help. And so he starts off, he's speaking to God, and he says, "God, I know you're righteous, yet let me talk with thee of thy judgments." It's like he's going to God and he's like, "God, I just need to have a word with you, because the way you're running things down here doesn't make sense." Jeremiah is struggling with the same problem. He knows who God is. He knows he's a righteous God. He knows he's a powerful God. He knows he's a loving God. But yet he sees the wicked prospering. He sees their evil going forth. And he says to God, "God, I need to have a talk with you about your judgment and how you're deciding to run these things." Jeremiah is struggling with the question of suffering. And so we see philosophers, scientists, and even prophets here are all struggling with the same question. So if you've ever asked those questions of how could God allow this to happen? Why doesn't God do something to stop this? You're in good company, because those questions have been asked by some of the brightest minds and some of the holy prophets of God as well. I mean, we've got two more verses to look at in this. In the Psalms, here in Psalms 94, verses 1 to 4, we read, "O Lord God, to whom vengeance belongeth. O God, to whom vengeance belongeth, show thyself. Lift up thyself, thou judge of the earth. Render a reward to the proud. Lord, how long shall how long shall the wicked triumph? How long shall they utter and speak hard things, and all the workers of iniquity boast themselves?" And to hear the psalmist is experiencing the same thing, this problem of knowing who God is, but yet knowing that suffering and evil exists. He calls out to God, "God, to whom vengeance belongeth," and tells him, "Show thyself, lift up thyself, thou judge of the earth." He's telling God to get up and do something. I know who you are. I know you're a God of power, of justice, of judgment, of love. You don't want this stuff to happen, yet you allow it to. Why don't you do something to stop it? And 3 times he cries out, "How long are the wicked going to continue? How long is evil and suffering going to continue before you do something?" And finally, in the book of Revelation, in this vision that's given to John under the 5th seal, we read this. "And when he had opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth?" So these people that are being depicted in this vision are crying out the same question to God. But the thing that I want to notice here is previously we looked at Jeremiah and the psalmist. These are people seeing the problem of sin and crying out to God. But this is a vision that God is giving to the Apostle John. Okay, so in this vision that God is giving to John, he's showing him these faithful martyrs. And the question that the faithful martyrs have is, God, why is there all this suffering? Why is there all this evil? Why are you not doing something? So this is a struggle that God is very aware that we have. It's a struggle that God shows the faithful martyrs struggling with the same question. Because the question of suffering is a very real question that we all deal with at some point in our life. And just a side point to note here, when we look at Jeremiah and the psalmist and even what God's showing the Apostle John here, God's actually happy. He's comfortable with Jeremiah and the psalmist crying out to God and saying, God, I need to have a word with you because what are you doing? Okay, often we have the idea that, you know, when we come to God, when we're going through things, we have to come to God and we have to pretend to be perfect in front of him. We have to pretend that we don't have questions, that we perfectly understand that he's in control and we trust him and we're fine with everything. But that's not what we see Jeremiah doing. Jeremiah is saying, look, God, I know you're a just God and you're righteous, but I'm having problems with what's happening here. I'm seeing the suffering and I'm not okay with it. Why is this happening? The psalmist is crying out the same thing. Okay, and God here is showing John that he knows this is something his people suffer with. God is okay when we come to him with these things and we are honest with him about the stuff that we are struggling with. So getting to this question of suffering, it's a question that scientists, that philosophers, that prophets have all struggled with. And when I've looked at this question and talked with people that have struggled with this question, I found that there are three reasons people ask the question, why does suffering exist? The first reason they're asking the question is because they're wanting to know how it happened. And that's what we're going to look at in this first part. How did sin and suffering and evil transpire? What were the events that transpired to bring us to where we are now in a world where we are surrounded by suffering? And to look at this, we're going to start with a parable Jesus told in the book of Matthew. Because here Jesus tells this parable and he touches on some of these same themes. I want us to listen to what he has to say here. In Matthew 13, starting in verse 24. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat, and went his way. But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath it tares? Now I want us to pay attention to the servant's question here. They're going up to the master and they're saying, you know, didn't you sow good seed? Didn't you make this field good? Why then does these tares, this bad seed, this weed exist? If you filled the field full of what was good, why does what was evil exist here? Jesus carries on this parable. He said, then said he unto them, an enemy hath done this. The servant said unto him, wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? He said, nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, gather ye first the tares, and bind them in bundles to be burned, to burn them. But gather the wheat into my barn. And so following up on the servant's question, he says, no, I sowed what was good, but there's an enemy who came, and the enemy sowed the tares. He sowed the bad seed. And in response to the servant's question, should we just get rid of them now? He said, no, there will be a time. It will not be like this forever. The harvest will come and it will split the two. But until then, they are going to grow together. And when we read down a bit further in verse 37, Jesus begins to tell us the interpretation of this parable. He answered and said unto them, he that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that soweth them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. So Jesus gives us all the symbols in this parable that he was talking about. This parable of farming is speaking about the creation of this world and how the Son of Man put children of the kingdom, created Adam and Eve in the beginning holy. They were children of God. But the devil came along and corrupted them. And that this will last until the end of the world, where it is fixed. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, did thou not sow good seed in the field? From whence hath it tares? That was their question. And when we explain this, their question is really what we are looking at, this question of suffering and evil. Why does it exist? Their question was a question of, did you not create the world good? Why is it full of evil and wickedness? His answer was, an enemy has done this. It is the devil, Satan, is the one responsible for introducing evil into this world. And the servant says, well, why don't we just go out and destroy all the wicked? Why don't we just gather up all the tares and get rid of them? He says, no, let both grow together until the harvest. So even though evil does exist, there will come a time when it will not. And so Jesus here is actually speaking back to the creation of the world. He's teaching how the world was created good and it became corrupted. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to actually jump back to Genesis. And we're going to look through Genesis 1 to 3 at the creation of the world and how it became corrupted, to see if we can build on the ideas that we've learned here in this parable. The first thing we find going through Genesis 1, when God created the world, is that 7 times we read that God saw what he had made and it was good. On the first day, he saw the light that he made, that it was good. On the third day, the land and sea was good and the vegetation is good. On the fourth day, the sun, moon, and stars are good. On the fifth day, all the sea creatures and the birds are good. On the sixth day, all the animals and everything that lives on the land is good. And then finally, he looks at everything he made in those first 6 days, and behold, it was very good. So God made everything good. It was a perfect world with no faults. And when it speaks of the creation of humans, here in Genesis 1 from verse 26, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. So God not only created everything good, he created humanity in his own image. Humans were created in the image of the divine, in the image of God himself. This is how the world was when God put things in motion, when God first created it. A perfect world with no fault, and a people that were created in God's image. But then when we jump to chapter 3, we read about the fall. We read about the serpent and how he began to sow wickedness among God's perfect creation. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field, which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of the trees of the garden, or every tree of the garden? Now I want to notice here what the serpent is coming to Eve with this deception. Yea, hath God said that you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? He's trying to exaggerate God's word to make it seem harsher. Because God didn't say you couldn't eat of every tree. What God said is right here in Genesis 2. It says, the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. So the serpent came with, it says, did God really say you couldn't eat of every tree? But here, no, God says you can eat of every tree, only of this one tree you cannot eat. So the serpent exaggerated God's word. But then when Eve's speaking to the serpent in response, she actually overstates God's word as well. And the woman said unto the serpent, we may eat of the fruits of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. In her attempt to defend against the serpent's over-exaggerated statement, she herself over-exaggerates, saying that God said you cannot even touch the fruit, which he never said. He only said don't eat it. The serpent's response. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die, for God does know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. So we've got this idea here. The world was created perfect. Okay? And the serpent came along to tempt Eve, trying to get her to distrust God's word, to believe that God's word was overburdening, exaggerating what he said. Then she went too far the other way in being zealous to defend it, overstating what God's word said again. And then finally, the serpent beguiled her and made her believe that God was holding back something good. And if she would only eat this, she would gain wisdom, the wisdom to the knowledge of good and evil. And I just want to make one point about what this knowledge of good and evil was, what that represented. Because if we look, as we saw, in the creation of the world, God declared what was good. Okay, God had the knowledge of good and evil, and he created a world that was good for us to live in and gave us what was good to live by. God was the one with this knowledge of good and evil. And then he put this tree of the knowledge of good and evil there and gave humanity a choice. Do we trust God's definition? Do we live by what God said was good and how God created the world in the way it is good? Or are we going to seek to gain this wisdom for ourselves, to be able to define what is good and evil for ourselves? Because ultimately, that's what that represented. It was that choice. Do we trust what God has said, or do we believe that we are wise enough to decide for ourselves? Do we live according to God's rules, to his law, if you will? Or are we going to decide that we're wise enough to decide our own laws and live by the laws of man in contradiction to God's law? That's the ultimate test that was put here in the garden. Will humans trust God's definition of good and evil? Or are they going to seize the opportunity to define good and evil for themselves? That this was what was at the heart of the first sin. Eve saw that the tree was desirable to make one wise. She could gain the wisdom. So she didn't need to live by God's definition of good and evil. She could create her own definition of good and evil and live by her definition, not God's. And it's interesting, this is the same, the same test that was in the garden there is what we see when we get into prophecy and we look at the end times tests that will be for the whole world. It's, do we go by what God has said, or do we go by what man has said? Are we going to worship in the way that God has told us is the good and right way to worship? Or do we believe that man can create our own way and do it according to our definition of what is good and evil? So where we find ourselves here with this introducing of suffering and evil into the world, God created a world that was good. The serpent beguiled humanity, told us not to trust in God, that he was holding something back, that we could define it for ourselves, that we could seek something greater than God has given to us. And instead of trusting God, we decided to reach for what the serpent was holding in front of us. And the serpent said in his deception, "You shall not surely die." He said, don't trust God, he's lying. This evil that he has told us won't happen. He says, God does know that when you eat it, your eyes shall be open. God is only trying to use scare tactics to keep you from something good. He told them that their eyes would be open, that they would gain the wisdom to be autonomous, to choose how they live their own lives. And you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. You can define that for yourself. You can lift yourself to a highest place than what God has created you to occupy. So we see God sowed his seed. Humanity was created in the image of God, in a perfect world, patterned after his goodness. But the devil came along and sowed his seed, distrust for God, saying that God's definition of good and evil was restrictive, that he was holding something back for us for our good, and that we are wise enough to define good and evil for ourselves, autonomous from God. And something I want to notice as well, this is how sin started on earth. This is how the devil sowed wickedness and sin and started suffering on earth. But this isn't where it started. It started first in heaven. That this was just an overflow of Satan's rebellion in heaven. And if we look at it, we go back to Satan. In Isaiah here, it speaks of him. It says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." Here it's describing, Satan's fall. What started this confrontation? What started Lucifer's rebellion? What started this evil and this wickedness? It was Satan's desire to rise above where he was, to exalt himself above all of the heavenly hosts, to sit on the throne of God. Just like we saw, he got Eve to start sin on earth by telling her she needed to desire something greater. The knowledge of good and evil that God had, that he had given us as a definition to live by. Okay, you don't need to trust that. You can take that knowledge for yourself and be free from God. You can define good and evil for yourself. You can rise above it and take something that God has not purposed us to have. The same rebellion that was in Satan, he brought out on earth. We find that here in Isaiah and as well in Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 28, we find another passage here talking about Satan. It uses here the title of the king of Tyrus. But as we read through, we see this is clearly talking about the angelic being. He says, "Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyrus, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God, thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, the topaz, the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, the carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou was created." So it's speaking about this angelic being that was there in the Garden of Eden. And that it was the perfection that Satan was created with. Every precious stone of gold and all the riches of beauty were given to Satan when he was created. There was nothing lacking in what God had given him. It carries on. "Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. Thou was upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in all thy ways from the day that thou was created until iniquity was found in thee." Again, and here Ezekiel's emphasizing the splendor that God had given Satan, the position that he had given him. "Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so." God is the one that created Satan perfect in all his ways until iniquity was found in him. Carries on. "Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay before thee kings, that they may behold thee." And so here we see, again, it speaks of Satan's fall, just like we saw with humanity. God created this world perfect and humans in his own image. Here, God created Satan perfect and given him the position right next to the throne of God, the cherub that covereth, walking up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Okay, there was nothing lacking that was given to him. But yet, he chose to corrupt himself. And so when we compare Satan's fall with humans' fall, we find that God created him good, just like he created them good. God gave him a place that was good, just like he gave humanity a place that was good to live in. The iniquity was found in him, in Satan, not in any fault of God. Same with humanity. There was no fault in God in our fall. It was our choice. Satan corrupted his own wisdom. And as we saw Eve there at the tree, she coveted that corrupted wisdom. Satan's heart was set on desiring a higher place. Just like with humanity, they desired a higher place than God had decided that it was good for them to occupy. So this is the follow-through of how it happened. This rebellion in heaven of this perfect being decided that despite all the goodness and perfect that God had created, he decided to corrupt himself, to desire that which was not good. And he brought out that same principles of rebellion, of distrust in God, of autonomy from God, of rejecting God's law and establishing our own way to live in contradiction to it. This is the answer to the first question. And although those 3 reasons why people ask why there is suffering in the world, the first question is they ask because they want to know how it happened. That is how it happened. Satan in heaven invented this idea of rebellion, invented this idea of casting off what is good and seeking after our own exaltation. And he brought that to earth. And our first parents followed him in his rebellion. They saw that they could rise above what God had decided was good for them to occupy. They thought to seize autonomy from God, to live by their own definitions of good and evil rather than what God had given us. And we all have carried on the same mentality, the same idea of living separately from God at some point in our lives. And it's something that we still struggle with often. We have all perpetuated the suffering in this world. So that's how we get to where we are. That's answering the first reason people ask the question. It's because they want to know how it happened. But the second reason they ask is because they want to know why it happened. And the question of why this happened can be broken down into 2 parts. First, what reason did Satan have for choosing sin? And secondly, why didn't God stop it from happening? This is the why did it happen? First, to look at Satan. Why did Satan choose to sin? As we read before in Ezekiel, it simply says this: "Thou was perfect in thy ways, from the day that thou was created, till iniquity was found in thee." And that this is actually the answer the Bible gives us. There was no reason. There was no iniquity. Satan didn't find any iniquity in the way God had created him. There was no iniquity in the world that God had created for him to live in. He was perfect in all his ways, from the day he was created until iniquity was found in him. And there's a statement that you may have heard that before, but sin is as unexplainable as it is inexcusable. If there could have been some fault in heaven that Satan had found, and that was the reason he rebelled, then there might have been just some justifiable cause for it, but there wasn't. There was no fault in any of God's works. The fault arose within Satan. And we're going to look at a second verse here in Philippians, speaking about the sufferings of Christ and what will happen as a result of this. We read in Philippians 2, starting in verse 8. "And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God hath highly exalted him and given him a name above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven and things in earth and things under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Now, I want us to just think about the implications of this. The carrying out of God's plan of salvation, of this great controversy, of Christ coming to the earth, manifesting forth God's character, showing that he is willing to die to save humanity, that is how much God is willing to give for others. That this just completely answered all of Satan's objection, so that every knee should bow and every tongue will confess. And it doesn't just say of humans, but of everything in heaven. That's all the angels as well. Satan himself will eventually be brought to confess that there was no reason, there was no why for why he decided to sin. There was no fault in any of God's creation. There was no fault in any of God's will. The fault lies solely with himself, and he will be brought to confess that. But the second question, when people ask, why did it happen, is the question of why didn't God stop it? Why did he allow it to play out? And to answer that, we're going to look at first at what options did God have? You know, if Satan decided to start this rebellion, to say that God's rules are restrictive, that God is unloving, he is selfish, he only wants everything for himself and is not willing to give for others. You know, what options did God have? The first option he had was he could have simply created beings that wouldn't be able to choose him. He could have just created robots. So Satan would have just been a machine, effectively, not being able to even understand the concept of justice or love or peace or freedom. And that would have stopped. There would have been no evil in the world. There would have been no nothing, but there would have also been no love. There would have been no ways to anyone to have freedom. And someone once said it, God would have had to create a world in which love and freedom were impossible. And to create that would have been more evil than to create a world in which evil could happen. God's next option was, as soon as Satan started these ideas and this rebellion, God could have just immediately destroyed it. Immediately destroyed Satan when evil began to arise. But what would have the result of that been? As soon as someone questions that maybe God isn't a God of love, God suddenly destroys them. That would only raise further suspicion. And okay, while no rebellion might have happened, people would have been living in fear. And again, it would have not been a universe in which love rules. It would have been a universe in which fear ruled. The next option is, okay, allow Satan to continue living. Okay, allow, humanity to carry on after the fall, but to prevent anyone from doing any evil. To have angels following you around the whole time, and whenever any evil is going to come, they jump in and they stop it. And it's like, having a secret police follow you around next to you every day, in your home, in your car, at work, and they're watching every single action you do. And as soon as you do something wrong, they're going to jump in and stop you. Is that a world that we want to live in? That's not a world where God's principles of love and free will can actually exist either. That is the definition of tyranny, totalitarianism, the ultimate big brother, not just surveillance, but enforcement state. God's final option was to let sin play out so all could see the result of choosing autonomy from God, of choosing to live separately of God's ways, of his law, of his definition of what is good and evil. So out of all the options that God had available to him when sin arose, there's only actually one option that is consistent with him being a God of love, a God who values freedom, a God who values justice. And that is to let it play out, is to let people see why he said what he said, is to let people see that he is truly a God of love. And that is why, as we read before, that at the end of it, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess. God has let this thing play out, and everyone will see that God was right, that his ways were just, and that there was no reason for rebellion or sin. We've got a few more reasons, though. Something to keep in mind here in these two verses is that sin will not last forever. As we see there in Romans 8, it says, "For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pains together until now." And in Matthew 24, when Jesus is giving the end times and he talks about wars and rumors of wars and plagues and famines, he says all these are the beginning of sorrows. In both these verses, you don't necessarily get it from the English, but when it talks about, travailing in pain or the beginning of sorrows, it's using the imagery of labor pains, okay? That in these worlds, we're suffering these pains, but at the end of it, there's going to be a birth of something beautiful, okay? That these will grow, that they'll be painful, there'll be suffering in this world, and that it will get worse, but that one day it will finish. And then we will have a new creation at the end of it, and that these sufferings will be over. So that's the first thing to keep in mind when we look at this. Is one, God allowing sin to play out was God's only real option for a God of love. Secondly, is that it will not last forever. Okay, it is coming to a climax, to an end point, at which we will have a new creation where all this is behind us. We see the same thing here as Paul's talking to the apostles in Acts 14. He says, confirming the souls of the disciples and exhorting them to continue in faith, and that through much tribulation, that we through much tribulation enter into the kingdom of God. Again, through much tribulation we enter into the kingdom of God. There is suffering in this world that we must endure, but there is an end, and at that end we will enter into the kingdom of God. Again, here in Romans 8, he says, "For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." Okay, there is an end of these things, and what we will get afterwards is better, and it is worth it. There is no one that's going to get to heaven and look back on the things we suffered on earth and think, yeah, I don't know if it was worth it. When we get there, it's going to seem like it was a small price we had to pay. All the sufferings of this world will seem like a small price to pay for the glory which shall be revealed. So these are the first 2 points here. Is firstly, it was the only option available to God for him to still be a loving God, is to let the whole universe see why he said it, to let us understand, to bring us in to his counsel, to see things from his point of view. Secondly, it is only a pin drop in light of eternity and the glory that will happen. It's only going to last for a time, and what we receive after will be far greater than anything we've suffered here. And thirdly, the universe that we will have after sin will be better than the universe we had before it. And there are several reasons for this. Firstly, we will actually know God's love. Here in 1 John 4, verses 8 and 9, we read, "He that loveth not, knoweth not God, for God is love. In this was manifest the love of God towards us, because that God sent his only begotten Son into the world, that we might live through him." If sin never happened, okay, God could have told us he was a God of love, and we could have believed him, but we never would have really known how much he loved us. It's only that we've seen this plan of salvation play out, and we've seen what God is willing to do for us, that we really know the extent of his love. It's like if you're in a relationship with somebody, okay, like me and my wife, like I know she loves me, and when I think about how do I know she loves me, I think of some of the hard times we've been through and what lengths she was willing to go for me. And it's the same thing with any relationship. You only really know how much somebody loves you when things go bad, or when trouble comes, and you are willing, you get to actually see what they're willing to do for you, and you get to see how much they love you. And if that never comes, you can still believe they love you. You still know, but you don't really appreciate the depth of the love they have for you. And that is the same. If sin had have never arisen, we would have never really understood the depths of God's love. It's the same with his grace. You know, as we read here in Romans, for as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound, but where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. That as sin has reigned unto death, even so might grace reign through righteousness unto eternal life by Jesus Christ our Lord. His love and his grace would have never been known if it wasn't for sin. And thirdly here, his righteousness also. The righteous standard of God's character, the righteousness that he gives us, it's only been revealed since sin has come into the world. You know, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. You know, if you have a torch, okay, and someone wants to show you how bright the torch is, and it's, you know, middle of the day, high noon, the sun's shining, and I turn the torch on, sometimes it doesn't really look that bright. But if you go out into a pitch black night and you turn it on, you can actually appreciate its brightness. Appreciating God's righteousness in a world where we never had anything to contrast it to. Okay, God said this is righteousness. God said this is how to live. God said, you know, this is the best way for the universe. Okay, we might believe him, but we would never really know how high that standard of righteousness is. You know, how true God's standards are, how righteous his law is. We would never know that if sin didn't happen. So our appreciation for who God is, his love, his grace, his righteousness, could have never been fully developed if sin had not have happened. Another reason why the world will be better off after sin than before it, for us, is that the Son of God will be one of us. This verse comes from Zechariah, speaking of a scene taken from heaven, where someone's walking up to Christ, and they ask him this question. It says, and one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thy hands? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friend. In heaven, here, Jesus is speaking there that he still bears the wounds that he received while on earth. He is still human. He will carry that humanity with him for all eternity. The Son of God has become one of us for all humanity. Next, the throne of God will be on earth. In Revelation, in chapter 21, verses 1 to 4, we read this. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, come down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. And God himself shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. And there shall be no more death, neither sorrow, nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. Before sin, we had the Garden of Eden on earth. After sin, we have the throne of God on earth. The tabernacle of God comes down. God will dwell on earth. Earth isn't just the dwelling place of humans. It will be the dwelling place of God. And again from Revelation, we read in chapter 3, verse 21, to him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and I sat down with my Father in his throne. And again, elsewhere, it says that we shall be priests and kings, rulers with Christ in this new heaven and new earth. The place that humanity will have in this recreated world will be higher than we would have ever had before. Not only is God's throne on earth, and he will dwell with us for all eternity, but we were all granted to be rulers of God's universe with Christ, to sit on his throne, to share in his rulership. And finally, sin shall never arise again. Here in Nehemiah, it says, what do you imagine against the Lord? He will make an utter end. Affliction shall not rise up a second time. And again in Isaiah 11, verse 9, he says, and they shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the seas. And so in both these verses, it's looking at the world after sin. And it's saying that affliction, that suffering will not arise a second time. Isaiah says there will be no hurt, no suffering. No one will hurt or destroy in this new created world. Okay? If sin had have not arisen, if Lucifer had have not rebelled, okay, there would have always been this possibility that one day it will arise. Okay, that one day someone will ask the question, maybe God isn't just, maybe God doesn't have our best interests at heart, and rebellion would start and suffering would occur. But once it's been finished, because God has let it play out, because God has shown the entire universe the true nature of sin as he knew it to be, we know that at the end, it will never arise a second time. We will have a universe that is perfect, where everyone in it has complete freedom and no one will choose sin. No one will choose to rebel against God. No one will choose autonomy from his ways. Not because he forces us to, but because we will know that he is righteous, that he is full of love, and that his grace is supreme. And because we will know what he is like, suffering will never arise again. So again, the three reasons people ask this question, why is there suffering? First, they want to know how it happened. And we saw the steps that took place from Lucifer's rebellion in heaven to humanity's rebellion on earth, and we've carried that on ever since. We want to know why it happened. There was no reason for Satan to start this, and he will even admit that in the end. And why didn't God stop it? Because he needed it to play out for our sakes, for the angels' sakes, for all of the rest of the unfallen world's sakes, so that we would know who he is as a God of love, grace, and righteousness. And that in the end, the universe would be better than if sin had never arisen. But the third reason that people ask the question, why is there suffering, is because they are suffering. And this is a very different answer that the Bible gives us when we're asking this question because we are suffering. Because often when we find ourselves in a position where we are actually experiencing pain and suffering, a lot of these more intellectual, more theological ideas can sometimes fail to provide us the comfort that we actually need. So when it comes to personal pain and suffering, the Bible gives this answer. In Isaiah 53, a prophecy about Christ as the suffering servant, we read, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people was he stricken. In answer to human suffering, he suffered. We read that in the Garden of Eden. Okay, in Genesis 3, as soon as humanity had sinned and rebelled against God, he came to them and he gives them the promise that the seed of the woman would bruise the serpent's head and the serpent would bruise his heel. When God saw sin come to this world and he knew the suffering that would accompany it, God's first response is telling them that I will send my son to suffer. God's first response to human suffering, to sin, to evil, is that his son came to suffer for us and with us. And now I just want to look at a few verses, the things that Jesus said while he was on the cross. First, in Matthew 27, verse 46. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? You know, this is Jesus' experience in the time of his suffering. He cries out, God, why have you forsaken me? Just like we saw, you know, when Jeremiah was talking to God, he said, God, I know you're righteous, but why is this happening? Okay, Jesus here in the time of his suffering is actually struggling with that same question. Now, I'm sure if we went to Jesus and we got out a quiz and we quizzed him on the plan of salvation, Jesus could answer that perfectly, but none of those intellectual, answers are providing relief for him here in the moment of his suffering. When he was speaking at the Mount of Olives, giving that Sermon on the Mount to thousands of people, when he was raising Lazarus from the dead, when he was feeding the 5,000, he knew where God was in his life. But now, in the moment of his suffering, he cries out, God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me? Jesus knows exactly what it's like to struggle with the problem of suffering, like Jeremiah did, like the psalmist did, and like many of us have done. Jesus knows what it's like to struggle with that problem of suffering because he has been there. I want to look at Luke now, and we find Jesus' final words on the cross here. In Luke 23, verse 46. And when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And having said thus, he gave up the ghost. He died. He said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. I want us to compare that with what we read in Matthew. He said, God, why have you forsaken me? But Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. In his suffering, he didn't know where God was, but he still knew who God was. And I find that an important lesson for us. In his suffering, he didn't know where God was. He couldn't see through this pain that he was in, through the grave that was before him. And he cried out, why have you forsaken me? But he still knew who God was. And so he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. He didn't know what was happening, but he still trusted that his Father had it under control. And a little earlier in Luke, we read this. Then said Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they parted his raiments and cast lots. This is when the soldiers had crucified him, and they're gambling to see who gets to take his clothes. Jesus is praying for them. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And I find this interesting because it's so opposite to how we as humans would see things. If you look throughout culture, throughout any stories, throughout any movies where there is a good versus evil, okay, whether it's Transformers, whether it's Avengers, whether it's Pokemon, there's always a similar theme in how we depict the battle of good and evil. There is some evil that rises up that is causing suffering. And the solution to this evil that causes suffering is for the good to overpower it, to outwit it, to outmaneuver it, and to destroy it and get rid of it. Okay? The answers that we always come up with whenever humans write a battle between good and evil is that the good must overpower and destroy that which is evil. But here, In Jesus' suffering, he does not reach for the power of God. He reaches for the grace of God. In his suffering, his mind was drawn to the grace of God to forgive these men, not to the power of God to destroy them. And so when we look at these three things that we see Jesus experiencing on the cross, him experiencing the same question of suffering, not knowing where God is at this moment of his suffering, not being able to understand why it's happening because the suffering is so intense. Why have you forsaken me? Yet still being able to trust in who God is. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And in the time of his suffering, his mind being drawn to God's grace, not to his power, to forgive and not to destroy. So when it comes to the problem of evil, many people want to ask God, why did we suffer? But a better question is to ask, why did God suffer? Because the answer to human suffering is the Son of God on a cross. So that's the answer he gave us when we're suffering with personal pain, is that Christ suffered for us and that he is with us in our suffering. In Hebrews, chapter 2, verse 18, we read this. For in that he himself has suffered being tempted, he is able to succor them that are tempted. He is able to help us because he suffered. He endured this suffering, this mockery, this torture. And not just the suffering that he experienced on the cross, but, after his baptism, he was in the wilderness for 40 days, suffering temptations and trials, and the devil came to him. And throughout his entire life, he suffered rejection, disappointment, betrayal, people speaking about him behind his back, spreading rumors and lies. His friends abandoned him. He was thrown to this false trial. Pilate declared him innocent 3 times and then still sent him off to be crucified. He suffered every form of injustice, rejection, and torture that humanity, that the evil that we have could throw at him. And he endured that all so that he can be with us in our suffering. So that when we are suffering, he can stand with us and saying, I know what it's like. When we are suffering and we are saying, God, why are you letting this happen? Even though we might not ever find out why it's happening, we know that he understands where we are. We know that he understands what it's like because he was there. That in our suffering, Jesus is able to comfort us. That's why it's so important that we understand Jesus as our comforter, because he is the only one that has experienced this pain. If we are going through things like this and we don't have him beside us, we can be lost like so many others. Like, as we looked at the beginning, men like Charles Darwin, who came to this problem of suffering and simply looked at it and said, I cannot make sense of this. The scripture must be wrong. This God that it speaks of cannot exist, because he couldn't understand why suffering exists, why there is evil. So to sum up, the 3 reasons why people ask why there is suffering in the world. The first reason they're asking it is they want to know how it happened. And we saw that. We saw the rebellion that started with Satan, that he desired something greater than God was giving him. He desired to replace God's on the throne, to replace God's law, to replace God's will. And that same rebellion was offered to humanity, and humanity chose to accept it. They chose to desire the wisdom that Satan was offering, to choose how we live, to desire autonomy from God's way. And all of humanity has participated in this rebellion as it's been played out throughout history. The second reason people ask this question is they want to know why it happened. Why did Satan choose to sin? Which even he himself will be forced to confess that there was no reason. And why did God allow it? Because it was the only way to get to a universe that is free from sin, that is free from suffering. I heard one person say that, the world that God created was not the best possible world that could exist, but it was the only way to get to the best possible world that could exist. God had to create creatures with free will, allow them to sin and rebel, watch it play out, so we could understand his love, his grace, his righteousness. And only then could God recreate a new world wherein dwells righteousness, where affliction will never arise again. And the third reason people ask the question, why is there suffering in the world, is because they are suffering. And when we suffer, God's answer to that is to look at Christ, that he suffered for us, and he is there with us to comfort us in our suffering.